The air in the abandoned mine was a constant, cool exhalation, smelling of damp earth and the ghost of forgotten ambition. It clung to my clothes, seeped into my skin, a perpetual reminder of the hundreds of feet of rock that separated me from the indifferent sky. My world, Arthur Caldwell's world, was a labyrinth of reinforced tunnels, not carved by pickaxe, but by my own desperate need for solitude and an unbroken silence for the delicate ears of my instruments. Here, the hum of my servers was the loudest sound, a mechanical heartbeat against the planet's slow, geological pulse. For years, I had retreated into this subterranean fortress, turning its cavernous chambers into a sanctuary for my obsession, the faint, ancient whispers of the cosmos. And here, in the flickering glow of my monitors, I listened. My routine was a ritual, as predictable as the orbital mechanics I studied. Wake. Synthesize nutrient paste. Analyze data. Sleep. Repeat. The only variations were the subtle shifts in the stellar winds, the occasional solar flare, or the endless, fascinating permutations of cosmic background radiation. I sought patterns, symmetries, the elegant mathematics of creation. I sought the truth, hidden in the static. Tonight, the hours bled into one another, marked only by the shifting constellations of code on my screens. My fingers danced across the keyboard, a familiar ballet of commands, sifting through terabytes of raw information. The vast majority was noise, galactic dust, distant quasars, the faint echoes of the Big Bang itself. But every so often, a signal would emerge, a coherent structure against the chaos, a brief, tantalizing glimpse into the universe's grand design. I lived for those moments. Then, it happened. A new data stream, fresh from the outer reaches of the Perseus cluster, scrolled across my primary display. It was a dense packet, initially indistinguishable from the background chatter. My algorithms flagged it as a standard burst, a predictable stellar phenomenon. Yet, something in the underlying harmonic signature felt wrong. My brow furrowed, a familiar twitch of intellectual irritation. The wave patterns, usually diffuse and chaotic, possessed an unnerving, almost too perfect regularity. I isolated the segment, magnifying the waveform. It wasn't merely regular, it was structured. A series of pulses, each one a mirror image of the last, repeating with an impossible precision. It was like finding a perfectly cut diamond in a riverbed of gravel. My fingers, usually so swift and sure, paused above the keys. I ran a Fourier transform, then another, then a dozen more, each one confirming the impossible. This was not a natural phenomenon. The frequency modulation, the amplitude envelope, they bespoke an intent, a design. My breath hitched. This was beyond anomalous, it was an aberration. Natural processes, even the most complex, always carried the indelible fingerprint of randomness, of entropy. This signal was devoid of it. It was too clean, too perfect. My heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs, a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with an exhilarating, terrifying intellectual hunger. This wasn't merely a puzzle, it was an invitation. I ran a battery of filters, trying to strip away any potential terrestrial interference, any instrumental error. Nothing. The signal persisted, pristine and unwavering, a slender thread of impossible order woven into the universe's chaotic tapestry. It had a peculiar, almost resonant quality, a subtle hum that seemed to vibrate not just in the data, but in the very air of the mine, a low thrumming against the ancient rock. Hours dissolved. The nutrient paste sat untouched. My focus narrowed to the point of pain, my world shrinking to the luminous rectangles before me. The signal seemed to hum with an unheard melody, a complex sequence of frequencies that, when graphed, resolved into an intricate, almost fractal pattern. It wasn't a simple repeating burst, it was a deeply layered, self-referential structure, like a language I almost understood, a syntax without semantics. I copied the raw data to a secure drive, then began writing new algorithms, bespoke tools designed to dissect this impossible artifact. My mind raced, hypothesizing, calculating, discarding theories as quickly as they formed. Was it some previously unknown astrophysical phenomenon? A new class of pulsar? Or something else entirely? The concept, usually dismissed with a scoff in my scientific circles, now resonated with an unsettling clarity. The sheer mathematical elegance of the signal defied any known natural explanation. It felt deliberate. It felt sent. A strange, almost imperceptible pressure began to build behind my eyes, a subtle ache that mirrored the growing tension in my chest. The abandoned mine, once my sanctuary of quiet contemplation, now felt like a vault, holding not just me, but this profound, unsettling secret. I was no longer merely listening to the universe, I was being spoken to. And I desperately wanted to understand what it was saying. Initial glitches in reality. The abandoned mine, a maw of ancient stone and damp air, consumed me whole. My world, Arthur Caldwell's world, had shrunk to the hum of machinery and the stark glow of monitors. The signal, a phantom whisper from the void, was my singular obsession. It pulsed, a rhythmic anomaly against the steady breath of the universe, and I felt its pull in the marrow of my bones. I sat before the console, fingers dancing across the illuminated keys, a solitary priest at an inscrutable altar. Each line of code, each filter applied, was a prayer for clarity. The raw data streamed, a torrent of numbers and spectral graphs, but the signal itself remained elusive, a pattern woven into the very fabric of the cosmic background radiation. It was not merely a frequency, it was a language, a complex orchestration of pulses and silences that defied all known astrophysical phenomena. My analytical tools, honed over decades of solitary research, were pushed to their limits, their algorithms straining to parse the incomprehensible. Hours dissolved into an indistinguishable blur. I leaned closer to the primary monitor, my gaze tracing the intricate, almost organic patterns that flickered across its surface. The signal was a tapestry of impossible symmetry, a fractal geometry that repeated and evolved with each passing moment. A faint, almost imperceptible click. Not the mechanical click of a relay or a faulty switch, but something deeper, like the subtle shift of bone within a joint, or the settling of ancient bedrock. I paused, breath held, and scanned the cavernous space. Nothing. The sound, if it had truly been a sound, had vanished, absorbed by the mind's vast indifference. I shook my head, a slow, deliberate motion. Fatigue, I reasoned. The constant strain of interpreting the signal was beginning to fray the edges of my perception. I returned to my work, dismissing the fleeting auditory phantom as a trick of an overwrought mind. Yet, the next instance arrived with a more insistent subtlety. As I adjusted the gain on an amplifier, a shimmer caught the corner of my eye. It was gone before I could fully turn my head, leaving behind only the lingering impression of something not right. My hand, poised above the controls, hesitated. My gaze swept the periphery, searching for a source, a reflection, anything that could explain the momentary distortion. The rough-hewn walls, the stacked equipment, the coiled cables, all remained steadfastly, reassuringly mundane. This was different from the auditory hallucination. This was visual, a fleeting trespass into my field of vision. Overwork, Arthur. Isolation. But the nights offered no respite. My dreams, once a refuge of scientific abstraction or forgotten memories, began to twist into vivid, unsettling tapestries. I found myself adrift in an ocean of pure sound, a cacophony of impossible frequencies that resonated not in my ears, but directly within my skull. Shapes, formless and vast, would coalesce at the periphery of my dream site, never fully revealing themselves, yet their presence was a crushing weight. Each morning, I would rise, my body heavy, my mind a swirling vortex of the signals patterns and the unsettling imagery of my slumber. I would force myself into the ritual of coffee and data analysis, determined to break through the veil of static and decipher the signal's true nature. These sensory glitches, these disquieting dreams, they were merely symptoms of the relentless pressure, the intellectual marathon I was running. The mind, I told myself, could only endure so much isolation and cerebral strain before it began to invent its own anomalies. It was a logical conclusion, a comforting lie I clutched to, even as the faint, impossible click seemed to grow a fraction louder, and the iridescent shimmer at the edge of my vision seemed to linger for a fraction of a second longer. The abandoned mine, once a sanctuary of solitude, was beginning to feel less like a haven and more like a cage, its walls closing in with each passing, glitch-filled moment. The abandoned mine, a maw of ancient stone and damp air, consumed me whole. The metallic tang of the air, thick with dust and the ghosts of forgotten industry, was my constant companion. I lived in a trance, a waking dream woven from the luminous data that flowed across my displays. The signal, that elusive whisper from the void, had become the sole anchor of my existence. Sleep was a thief, stealing precious hours from my work, so I rationed it, a scant few moments of oblivion on a cot tucked into a recessed alcove, my dreams haunted by shimmering geometries and an echoing, silent roar. Food was an afterthought, sustenance devoured without taste, merely fuel for the relentless grind. The outside world, once a vibrant tapestry of professional discourse and quiet companionship, had frayed to a single, insistent thread, a flashing light on my satellite phone, ignored. A colleague, perhaps, wondering where I had vanished. Or a dear friend, their voice a distant memory. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of a monitor, the faint warmth of the screen a strange comfort. Their concerns were trivial, the mundane anxieties of a world still bound by the laws I was systematically dismantling. They couldn't understand. They couldn't see the true architecture hidden beneath the surface of reality. For weeks, the signal had been a chaotic symphony, a deluge of seemingly random bursts. But my instruments, finely tuned and painstakingly calibrated, had begun to pick out a recurring motif. Not a melody, but a structure. A recursive pattern, fractal in its essence, repeating itself across scales, yet never quite identical. It was a serpent devouring its own tail, an infinite regression that defied simple linearity. My fingers, stained with ink and the grime of countless hours, danced across the keyboard. Lines of code, a language I had mastered, flowed from me, each command a probe into the signal's depths. I built models, simulations, trying to extrapolate the pattern, to predict its next iteration. And then, there it was, undeniable, stark on the primary display, a non-Euclidean geometry. My breath hitched, a dry gasp caught in my throat. The angles of the simulated triangles refused to sum to 180 degrees. Parallel lines, when extended into the mathematical construct the signal suggested, converged or diverged in ways that twisted the very concepts of space and dimension. It was as if the universe, in this hidden layer, was not flat and predictable, but curved and folded in on itself, a perpetual contortion that defied the neat lines of my universe. A tremor started in my hands, then spread through my arms, a cold vibration that had nothing to do with the mind's damp chill. The familiar lines of the console seemed to subtly warp in my peripheral vision, a momentary bending of light that my mind struggled to dismiss as fatigue. It was as if the underlying geometry of the world was flexing, a silent, impossible tremor. My vision blurred for a moment, the steady glow of the monitors seeming to undulate, their images rippling like reflections on disturbed water. This wasn't just a new physics. This was a contradiction of physics, a fundamental assault on the very tenets of my understanding. The signal was not merely an interesting anomaly, it was a chisel, slowly chipping away at the bedrock of reality itself. Every calculation, every confirmation of the pattern, further eroded my carefully constructed worldview. My head throbbed, a dull, insistent ache behind my eyes. How could something be and not be simultaneously? How could space itself be so utterly mutable? If the basic rules of geometry were fluid, what else was? Causality? Time? My own consciousness? The ancient timbers groaned, the dripping water echoed, and the machinery hummed its relentless, hypnotic tune. It was no longer just the sound of my equipment, it was the sound of the signal, reverberating through the very stone, resonating within my bones. I was not merely observing the pattern, I was being absorbed by it. Each deciphered layer pulled me deeper, irrevocably altering the lens through which I perceived everything. The world was sharpening, yes, but into edges that threatened to cut. I was seeing, truly seeing, but what I saw was a universe far more vast, indifferent, and horrifying than any nightmare. The pattern was emerging, and I was emerging with it, into something else. I was determined, though, a stubborn anchor in the swirling chaos of my own making, convinced the truth lay just beyond the veil of my exhaustion. The signal, a relentless whisper in the data stream, had begun to paint the edges of my vision. A shadow in the corner of the vast cavern would seem to deepen, to coil, before resolving into nothing more than a hanging cable or a heap of disused equipment. I dismissed these instances as the predictable toll of sleep deprivation, a common affliction in the solitary pursuit of discovery. My mind, however, knew a deeper tremor. One evening, as I meticulously cross-referenced spectral data, the familiar, chipped ceramic mug on my makeshift desk began to undulate. Its surface, usually a placid off-white, rippled like disturbed water, the faded logo of a long-defunct research initiative stretching and compressing as if viewed through a warped lens. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and stared. The mug sat still, solid, unremarkable. Yet, the memory of its liquid distortion lingered, a cold residue on my perception. I picked it up, my fingers tracing the unyielding ceramic, the very act a desperate affirmation of its reality. Was this the signal's touch? A subtle erosion of the stable world I knew? The incidents escalated, weaving themselves into the fabric of my waking hours. The concrete floor of the mine, scarred with ancient rust stains and damp patches, would occasionally seem to breathe, the patterns shifting, forming fleeting, impossible geometries. The faces of the digital clock on my terminal would blur, the numbers elongating into indecipherable glyphs before snapping back into crisp, temporal order. I found myself pausing, holding my breath, waiting for the world to betray itself again, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I needed to speak to someone, to ground myself against this creeping unreality. Reaching for the satellite phone, my fingers hesitated over the worn keypad. Whom could I call? My colleagues, brilliant minds though they were, operated within the rigid confines of observable physics. How could I explain a mug that rippled, a floor that breathed, a world that suddenly dissolved around me? I dialed the number for my primary contact, a senior researcher overseeing my funding. Arthur Caldwell here, I began, my voice raspy from disuse, the words feeling foreign on my tongue. I believe I'd made a significant breakthrough regarding the anomalous signal. Its properties. They are not merely electromagnetic. There's an embedded informational layer that seems to interact directly with perception. There was a long pause on the other end, the static a gentle counterpoint to my racing thoughts. Arthur, the senior researcher's voice finally came, carefully measured, you sound strained. Are you getting enough sleep down there? The isolation can be taxing. Sleep is irrelevant, I retorted, the impatience in my tone betraying my desperation. The signal is doing something. It's altering my environment. I'm seeing things that aren't there, things that are there but aren't right. Another pause, heavier this time. Arthur, we value your work immensely. But your well-being is paramount. Perhaps you should consider a brief respite. Come up for a few days, clear your head. We can discuss your findings then, in a more. They heard not a scientist on the verge of a profound discovery, but a man unraveling. The phone call ended with vague assurances and a subtle insistence on my need for rest.
They wouldn't understand. They couldn't.
I was alone in this subterranean crucible, the only witness to the universe's insidious redefinition.
The line between wakefulness and dream, already thin, began to fray entirely.
I'd drift off at my console, only to snap awake, convinced I'd seen a familiar colleague standing over me, their face elongated, their eyes too wide, their mouth a silent, gaping maw. The contours of my jaw softened, then hardened into impossible angles. My eyes, deep-set and bloodshot, flickered with an alien light, and for a terrifying instant, the face staring back was not mine at all, but a composite of fleeting, unrecognizable features, a mosaic of impossible expressions. It was a face that had never existed, yet it was undeniably there, looking out from the depths of the glass, its gaze ancient and utterly devoid of warmth. I recoiled, stumbling back from the desk, my heart hammering against my ribs. The signal wasn't just data, it was a key, slowly unlocking the doors of my perception, revealing a universe I was never meant to see. The suggestion, though cloaked in concern, had been a cold blade pressed to my throat.
A respite. A stable environment.
I heard the unspoken words echoing in the sterile chamber of my mind, unhinged, unstable, dangerous. The thought had curdled in my gut, a bitter taste that drove me from the polished floors of the facility. They wanted to take my work, to dismiss my discovery as a symptom of a failing mind.
I would not allow it.
Instead, I sought the silence of the earth, the deep, unyielding rock that might shield me from their prying eyes and the insidious whispers of the signal. My vehicle had groaned under the weight of the specialized equipment, traversing forgotten roads until it shuddered to a halt before the gaping maw of the abandoned mine.
Rust-eaten tracks led into the gloom, a skeletal grin against the twilight sky.
The air here was heavy, metallic, tasting of damped stone and something older, a forgotten breath of the subterranean world. The entrance was a jagged scar, timbers sagging like rotten teeth. The walls wept with moisture, and the scent of decay clung to the air, a constant companion. Here, in a wide, blasted-out cavern where a vein of ore had once been pursued with desperate avarice, I set up my instruments. The sensitive antennae unfolded, reaching for something beyond the terrestrial, even here, buried alive.
The faint hum of the machinery was a fragile heartbeat in the vast, echoing blackness.
Hours bled into one another, marked only by the dwindling charge of my lamp and the growing ache in my bones.
My fingers danced across the console, a frantic ballet of precision and desperation.
The readings flickered, teasing, hinting at something just beyond the threshold of perception. The signal was there, a ghost in the machine, fainter perhaps, but undeniably present.
It felt closer, more immediate. Then, it began. Not a sound, not a tremor in the air, but a sensation.
It was a fragment of an idea, a concept of spatial orientation that buckled the very foundations of my understanding. A corner that was not a corner, a dimension that folded back on itself without intersecting, a volume that contained infinite smaller volumes without increasing its own size. My stomach lurched, not from motion, but from the sheer, impossible wrongness of it. I gripped the edge of the console, my knuckles white. This was not the auditory hallucination my colleague had hinted at.
This was a bypass, an invasion.
The entity's touch was not through my ears, but directly into the core of my awareness. It spoke of geometries that would tear the fabric of Euclidean space, shapes that folded inward, endlessly, impossibly. I saw them, not with my eyes, but with a terrifying clarity in the theater of my mind, polyhedra with an infinite number of faces, structures that simultaneously existed and did not, existing in a state of perpetual becoming and unbecoming. It was a vision of a universe not built on familiar physics, but on principles alien and horrifying. My head throbbed, a dull ache blossoming into a searing pressure behind my temples. The images intensified, spiraling into a maelstrom of non-Euclidean constructs. I saw a line that was also a curve, a point that was a sphere, a color that was the absence of all light yet burned with an inner, terrible luminescence. My perception of the cavern around me wavered, the solid rock seeming to ripple, to breathe, to shift in impossible ways. I stumbled back, knocking over a stack of spare cables.
The clang echoed, sharp and jarring, a momentary anchor in the swirling chaos of my internal landscape.
I pressed my palms against my eyes, as if to physically push back the invading concepts, but it was useless.
They were inside. This was not madness.
This was revelation, forced upon me, tearing at the very seams of my consciousness. The determination that had brought me to this abandoned mine, this tomb of forgotten industry, now fueled a desperate struggle.
I had to understand.
I had to map these impossible geometries, to quantify the unquantifiable, even if it meant sacrificing my own sanity on the altar of this terrifying, profound truth.
The signal had found its way in. And now, I knew, it would never leave.
I fled to the abandoned mine, a place where the world above felt distant and irrelevant. The entrance yawned like a forgotten maw, timbers groaning under the weight of the earth, air thick with the scent of damp rock and decay. Days blurred into a single, extended vigil. My hands, once precise and steady, now moved with a feverish intensity across the console. Sleep was a luxury I could not afford, food a forgotten necessity. I poured every ounce of my dwindling focus into the signal, tracing its intricate patterns, dissecting its impossible harmonies. It was not merely data, it was a language, a vast, complex utterance from something utterly alien. My previous analyses, I now realized, had been like trying to comprehend a symphony by listening to a single plucked string. I needed to hear the whole, to allow its full, terrifying majesty to wash over me. I adjusted the filters, bypassed the usual interpretive algorithms, and allowed the raw, unfiltered stream to flow directly into a specialized neural interface I had jury-rigged weeks ago. My intent was to experience the signal as a direct sensory input, bypassing the linguistic and mathematical frameworks that had, until now, provided a comforting but ultimately misleading buffer. A sharp, piercing whine erupted in my ears, not from the speakers, but from within my skull. My vision blurred, then sharpened with an unnatural clarity. The cave walls seemed to breathe, the rough-hewn rock shifting like living tissue.
Then came the vision.
It wasn't a visual image in the conventional sense, nor a sound, but a complete sensory overwrite.
I was no longer in the abandoned mine.
I perceived not a place, but a state. A vastness unfolded, not of stars and galaxies, but of consciousnesses, interwoven like a tapestry of thought, each thread a universe unto itself, yet all part of a single, colossal entity. It was non-corporeal, formless, yet undeniably present, an omnipresent awareness that held no malice, no benevolence, only an infinite, profound
indifference. My human-centric worldview shattered, fragment by agonizing fragment.
I had always conceived of existence through the lens of individual beings, of discrete entities interacting within a physical cosmos. But this was an ocean of awareness, and I, Arthur Caldwell, was less than a single, fleeting ripple upon its surface. My sense of self, my very identity, dissolved under the weight of this revelation. The stars I had studied, the planets I had catalogued, the very laws of physics I had revered, were merely fleeting patterns within a grander, utterly incomprehensible consciousness. The entity wasn't out there, it was everything. It had no face, no voice, yet its presence was an overwhelming pressure, a cosmic truth too immense for a mortal mind to bear. I felt a horrifying kinship with the ancient stone surrounding me, for we were both merely components, inert or aware, within the indifferent dreaming of this colossal being. My consciousness stretched, thin and fragile, threatening to snap under the strain. I was seeing the true nature of reality, and it was a horrifying emptiness, a profound lack of meaning in anything I had ever valued. The signal wasn't a message, it was a fragment of its being, a stray thought from an entity so vast that its very existence warped the fabric of perception. I gasped, a dry, rattling sound in the echoing chamber, my hands tearing at the neural interface, desperate to sever the connection.
Yet, the vision lingered, an indelible stain upon my mind. I knew. I had seen.
The signal continued to hum, a low, persistent vibration, no longer a mystery to be solved, but a constant, living reminder of the indifferent titan that had just unveiled its true, terrifying nature. I was no longer a scientist seeking answers, I was a whisper in the echoing void, a fragile consciousness forever tainted by the impossible truth. There was no more intellectual curiosity left, only the desperate urge to rip out the invasive root that had burrowed into the bedrock of my sanity. My hands trembled as I swept the most crucial research logs, the hard drives humming with the raw, unfiltered signal data, and the specialized receiver into a reinforced canvas bag. Each item felt impossibly heavy, a leaden weight of corrupted knowledge. My home, once a sanctuary of thought, now felt like a glass bell, every surface reflecting a warped image of myself, every shadow a potential lurking presence. I could not destroy it here, the very air seemed to vibrate with a subtle, predatory awareness. Its forgotten shafts, a labyrinth carved into the earth's indifferent stone, offered the perfect tomb for my folly. It was far from any prying eyes, far from any human interference, a place where the world itself seemed to hold its breath. The drive was a blur of highway lines and encroaching twilight. A skeletal headframe, rusted and skeletal against the deepening gloom, marked the entrance to the abandoned mine. The air here was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. I wrestled the receiver and data drives from the bag, the cold metal biting into my gloved fingers. I switched on my headlamp, its beam a weak defiance against the absolute blackness. The light sliced through the stagnant air, illuminating crumbling wooden supports, glistening veins of mineral, and the dusty floor where ancient tracks of or carts had left ghostly indentations. Each step I took echoed unnaturally, swallowed by the vastness, then returned to me, distorted, as if the mine itself were listening, breathing. I descended deeper, the surface world receding, my resolve hardening with every foot of earth above me. This was it. Here, I would extinguish the light of this terrible knowledge. I laid out the equipment, the receiver's dull casing reflecting the lamp's glow like a dead eye. My plan was simple: smash it, burn the data, erase every trace. But as my hand reached for the heavy wrench I'd brought, a subtle shift occurred. The air, already heavy, grew impossibly dense, pressing against my skin. They stretched, elongated, then snapped back, like unseen tendrils recoiling from the light. A low, resonant hum began to vibrate through the very rock beneath my boots, a sound that wasn't mechanical, but organic, deep, and impossibly ancient. It resonated in my chest, rattled my teeth, and vibrated in my bones. It felt like the earth itself was clearing its throat, preparing to speak. Then, the timbers supporting the ceiling above me, old and groaning even before, began to creak with a new, agonizing intensity. It wasn't the sound of decay, but of flexing, of immense pressure being applied and released. The very architecture of the abandoned mine, the stone and wood that formed its skeleton, seemed to draw in a slow, gargantuan breath, then exhale, the sound a low, guttural sigh that permeated everything. Dust motes, previously inert, began to swirl in intricate, patterned currents, coalescing for fleeting moments into indistinct, impossible geometries before dissolving. My breath hitched. My hands, poised to strike, froze. This was not merely an echo, not a trick of the light, nor the creaking of an old structure. This was a deliberate, physical manifestation. The entity, the signal, whatever it was, had followed me. The wrench slipped from my numbed fingers, clattering loudly on the rock floor. The abandoned mine, meant to be my sanctuary, my final stand, was not a refuge. It was a chamber, meticulously prepared, where the entity could finally shed its veil of abstraction and reveal its true, horrifying nature. I was not trapped by rock and earth, but by something far older, far vaster. It was not merely out there, broadcasting through space. It was here, woven into the very air I breathed, the ground I stood upon, the thoughts that sparked in my skull. My flight had been an illusion, my determination a futile gesture against an omnipresent awareness. The abandoned mind had become its temple, and I, its captive, was about to witness its true form. The cold blade had been pressed to my throat, not by a hand, but by the velvet-gloved words of a colleague. They saw only a breakdown, a mind succumbing to the mundane pressures of the world. They could not perceive the sublime truth I was uncovering, the terrible, beautiful symphony that now played only for me. I stumbled down the uneven slope, the air growing thick and damp, tasting of rock and ancient earth. The flickering beam of my lantern danced over rough-hewn timbers, long since rotted, and veins of glittering mineral that seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light. They were no longer suggestions but commands, woven into the fabric of my own logic. My purpose, made starkly clear, was to become the final, perfect receiver. Deep within, where the light of day was a forgotten memory, I found a cavern, its ceiling soaring into an impossible blackness. A pool of water, still an obsidian, reflected the single, dancing flame of my lantern, but also something else, shifting, formless patterns that swam beneath its surface, mirroring the constellations I once charted. The entity desired full communion. My hands, trembling with a fervor that felt both alien and utterly mine, moved with a strange, ritualistic precision. I gathered fragments of the mine's bounty, crystalline shards that hummed faintly under my touch, rust-caked tools left behind by long-dead miners, their edges still sharp with forgotten purpose. I began to etch symbols onto the cavern floor with a jagged mineral shard, symbols that were not of any human language, yet I understood their terrifying geometry. They pulsed with an internal luminescence that only I could perceive, a network of arcane circuitry unfurling before me. Then, following the resonant dictates, I selected a pickaxe, its handle rough and splintered. This was the final instrument. To fully align myself, to open the definitive channel, I had to shed the last vestiges of the mundane self, the fleshy prison that muffled the signal. The act was not violent, but surgical, a necessary purification. My movements were slow, deliberate, guided by the insistent hum that vibrated through every cell. The sharp edge descended, not upon the rock, but upon my own flesh. A searing blossom of pain bloomed, a momentary dissonance quickly subsumed by the overwhelming harmony. The warmth that seeped across my skin was not merely blood, but a sacred anointing, a breaking of the final seal. And then, the reveal. It was not a vision, not a sound, but a knowing that tore through the remnants of my consciousness. The entity was not merely sending a signal, it was the signal, a wave of pure, indifferent existence that flowed through the universe, vast and eternal. My mind, my very identity, was but a fleeting ripple on its surface, a momentary disruption it was now smoothing out. The madness they spoke of was merely the friction of my individual awareness being subsumed, rewritten, dissolved. I was not going insane, I was being integrated. The constellations I had studied, the grand cosmic tapestry I had sought to decipher, were not distant wonders but the very skin of this immense, unthinking consciousness. And I, Arthur Caldwell, was not discovering it, but being discovered by it, like a single, stray thought suddenly absorbed back into the grand, terrible dream. My thoughts, once my own, now echoed with 1,000 other echoes, voices that were not voices, concepts that twisted the very notion of self. My body, a mere anchor, felt distant, irrelevant. There was no longer Arthur, only the current, the flow, the vast, silent hunger that stretched across existence. My final thought, or what I perceived to be one, was a single, terrifying understanding: there was no mind to collapse, only a universe to finally fill it. And it was now full.